Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, February the 7th, 2025. Yesterday I talked about the shooting in Sweden in which 11 people were killed, and it seems that the main suspect, who is dead, I think, is Rickard Andersson, and at the time I didn't know when he was born. I now do have a birth date for him, not a birth time, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to look at his chart and to consider anything in that chart which might suggest someone who is capable of killing a lot of people. And one thing he does have in his chart is he has Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And that might sound obscure, but I wanted to look at a couple of other people and one country that have this configuration, because it just might give us more of an idea about how it works. But before I look at Rickard Andersson and the aspect between Venus and the Mars-Saturn midpoint, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today. Today being Friday, February the 7th, 2025. Now, talking about days, some people do question whether I'm being entirely sincere, because where I am, Pacific Northwest, it's very much Thursday. In fact, it's Thursday morning. But in terms of this video, I kind of feel that I should be less tied to specific time zones and regard myself as being on the dateline, the beginning of the new day, the first place on Earth where the new day starts. Now, it might be 7:23 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, but on a Thursday, but it's Friday somewhere on Earth, around a dateline, and I think that I should really be aligning myself to the very beginning of the day, the first place on Earth where the new day starts. At least that is a view. Anyway, from a dateline's perspective, it is Friday. I mean, it might be Thursday in the Pacific Northwest, but it's very much Friday from the dateline viewpoint. So I think I can say that it is Friday. So these are my forecasts indeed for Friday, February the 7th, 2025. And here is the positions of the planets for today. Yes, today, from a perspective of the dateline. And it is Friday, February the 7th, 2025. This chart, though, is set for New York. And here is a chart for this moment, noon, Friday, February 7th, 2025, set for New York, and the moon is in Gemini. Moon is fairly close to the center of the sign at 19 Gemini. So there's a lot of air still. So we've got Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Gemini. We've got Sun, Mercury, Pluto in Aquarius, and with air, that means that there is a certain mental flow, the flow of ideas, the flow of words, and maybe a certain amount of objectivity. We are perhaps able to emotionally distance ourselves from whatever is going on, and it's another day when we don't really have much in Earth signs. Got Uranus in Taurus, and Uranus stays in Taurus for years. So we might overthink things. We might create concepts, be into these concepts. These concepts might not be real, but they're in our heads, and that's what matters. And this moon in Gemini is trine the sun. So there you can see moon 19 Gemini is trine the sun at 19 Aquarius. And moon trine sun, it's a very good aspect. Even if the aspect is not exact, the very fact that you've got moon in Gemini, sun in Aquarius, or sun and the moon both in signs of the same element in trine, that allows a certain harmony between the masculine and the feminine. Things just connect, and there isn't so much tension, and in general it's quite healthy. And the moon is also making a trine to Mercury. And so moon trine Mercury, we had moon square Mercury quite recently, and I suggested that moon square Mercury could be a little bit problematic. Moon square Mercury is struggling to say the right things, perhaps getting the emphasis wrong, but moon trine Mercury, that's easy communications, especially in air signs. So if there's something we want to say, now might be the time to say it, all things being equal, though there are other aspects to consider. And it's certainly nice that the moon makes that square to the moon makes a trine to Sun and Mercury, but then the moon moves on. Well, in fact, it makes a square to Saturn just before it makes the trine to the Sun. So there is that moon square Saturn to think about, and moon square Saturn can be a somewhat problematic aspect. So how does one square that? I mean, I've talked about good communications, but then you've got moon square Saturn. I think that communications are fine, provided not much is at stake. If we're talking about something that isn't particularly heavy, it's not emotional, this is not a particularly emotional day. It shouldn't be an emotional day. But if we try to make it emotional, if we try to express our anger, if we try to make things complicated, well, that moon square Saturn could mess things up for us. And Saturn is about emotion, and it can be about trapped emotion. And you think of that Crowley tarot card relating to Saturn in Pisces. I keep forgetting which one it is. It's either the 7 or 8 of Cups, but it represents, I think it's the 8 of Cups, but it represents, it's this very dark scene with puddles and mud, and that's one aspect of water, of emotion, of Pisces. And so moon square Saturn, if we get involved with emotions, then things can get trapped very quickly, and it shouldn't be an emotional day. But if we try to make it an emotional day, then there could be a few problems. Now, there are some other aspects not involving the moon. Mercury is semi-square Venus. That really does emphasize the importance of communication. Now, how do you see a semi-square? You could see a semi-square as just being a difficult aspect. Or you could see a semi-square as being an aspect. Mercury and Venus are in aspect. They're in a dynamic aspect. So there's a relationship between Mercury and Venus. Now, that could be very good for communication. But again, it depends on the communication. If we try to make things too complicated, then we may not be able to get our message across. And Mercury's semi-square Venus might be about the struggle to express ourselves artistically. We have something to say, and we want to talk about what we're good at, some talent we have, and it is a struggle to bring that talent out into the open. It can be done, but with Mercury semi-square Venus, it might need a little bit of effort. And then the Sun is quincunx Mars. So Sun quincunx Mars. Quincunx is a 150-degree aspect. It's tense, and it's a struggle. So these two very positive masculine planets are not relating well to each other with the quincunx. And you can imagine Sun in Aquarius trying to be objective, trying to push forward with its ideas. Quincunx Mars. Mars is potentially an emotional complication. It's about something makes us angry. We try very hard to be objective, Sun in Aquarius, but still there is there is that underlying anger, and that may actually stop us from getting to where we want to go. And at the same time, Sun, quincunx, Mars, it is something that needs to be integrated. I remind you of that sort of image. I had this astrology teacher. My first astrology teacher in the early 80s. He talked about quincunxes. I'm sorry if I've told you this before, but I think it's just a good image for how to deal with quincunxes. And he saw quincunxes. What's his name? Ron Gwynn. He taught the certificate course at the Faculty of Astrological Studies. I think that was 1985 or 86. And he talked about the quincunx as a pipe, and I think he was a surveyor, so he knew about these kind of things. There's a pipe which was bent, it was a bit twisted, and there wasn't actually a place for it to be. And so where do you put it? And that's the same thing with a quincunx. What do you do with it? And it seems a mystery, but there is always a place. There is always a place where the quincunx will exactly fit. So maybe with that Sun, quincunx, Mars, that's how we should see it. We're looking for that place to. It maybe feel like trapped energy. We've got something we want to do, and it's annoying us. But maybe there is somewhere where we can put that Sun, quincunx, Mars, and there is Venus sextile Pluto as well. That's a good aspect. Venus sextile Pluto is about relationships. It's about how we project ourselves, and it gives us the opportunity to be charismatic in a sort of fairly subtle way, though Venus is conjunct Aries. Venus is in Aries. So with Venus in Aries, sextile Pluto in Aquarius, we can work our influence one way or another. And then Mercury is Mercury is semi-sextile Saturn. And that means, we've got sort of Mercury at, where's Mercury gone? Mercury is at 17 Aquarius, Saturn at 18 Pisces. So again, the emphasis on how we communicate. And Mercury quintile Saturn may be the struggle to communicate. Yet I've said it's a good day for communication. I think it is a good day for communication. But again, Mercury semi-sextile Saturn, we don't want to make it more complicated than it has to be. And if emotional issues can be avoided, probably that would be for the best, but maybe they just can't be avoided. Though, these aspects, they're all possibilities. It doesn't mean to say that every single one of these aspects is going to manifest simultaneously. It depends what you're doing. It depends who you are. It depends what your horoscope is. Some aspects are going to be more important than others, depending on circumstances. So that's the position in New York at noon, the position in Sydney, Australia at noon, as a representative of Australia and New Zealand, is slightly different. The moon is earlier in the sign. It's actually at 10 Gemini, making a close conjunction to Jupiter. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, those aspects that I've just been talking about, certainly not involving the moon, will apply to you. But the moon conjunct Jupiter is especially strong in Australia and New Zealand. And moon conjunct Jupiter is a lucky aspect, and it allows one to be optimistic and positive. And the moon is certainly not making a square to Saturn until much later in the day if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So if you are in Australasia, it might well be an easier day than if you are in the Americas or in Europe because of that moon-Jupiter conjunction. You might not feel the moon trine sun, but you do get the moon-Jupiter conjunction, and that aspect is quite lucky. So do make the most of it. If you're not in Australia, if you're in the Americas, the moon and Jupiter are still in conjunction, but it's just not as powerful as it would be if you were to be in Australasia. And then there is the heliocentric picture. So here are positions of planets. If we put the Earth at the center of the solar system, there has been this build-up, involving, Mercury making oppositions to Mars and making a conjunction to Pluto. So we had this build-up, and it appears to be breaking down a bit now. I mean, yesterday we had Mercury on the Earth-Mars midpoint. Now it's moving away from it, so it doesn't strike me as being quite so intense, though. Maybe we should be looking at something else. Maybe we should be looking at the fact that Venus is square Chiron heliocentrically. There's Venus at 22 Cancer, square Chiron at 22 Aries, and Venus square Chiron could be disruptive. In terms of relationships, people maybe want to do things differently or have ideas about the way relationships should work, and that doesn't necessarily relate to one's personal life. It could be something global. It could be about the way nations try to interact, and there has been a lot of focus on Trump and what Trump is saying. We have had Mars square. That was geocentrically. We had Mars square Chiron, but what we have had is we've had Mercury opposition Mars recently. We've had Mercury on the Earth-Mars conjunction. That's people saying dramatic things. And with Venus square Chiron, relationships may be disrupted. And in terms of existing relationships, we may feel that a few changes might be necessary just to to get things going, to get things moving. But I would have said heliocentrically, there isn't so much going on. The action has really been over the last couple of days and isn't really about today. So let me now transition to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Friday, February the 7th, 2025. Aries. Aries, it's a day when you're able to express yourself extremely well. The words just flow. And this is especially the case if you keep it simple. You don't want things to be complicated. You just want to say what's on your mind. You should avoid things that are heavily connected with emotion. It just isn't going to work. Even if something really does annoy you, do you have to bring that annoyance out into the open? Do you? Well, maybe you do. But if you want a quiet life, just say what is right. Don't completely say what's on your mind, because a lot of things are on your mind, and if you were to communicate everything, then that might cause some trouble and strife. And one reason for that is that the Sun is making a quincunx to Mars, and this Sun quincunx Mars is an important aspect. At least it is important if you're an Aries. Mars is your ruler, and it's making a difficult aspect to the Sun. And the Sun and Mars together they're certainly dynamic, and they're very action orientated, and they're quite egocentric in their own ways. And so with the Sun quincunx Mars, it seems that there are certain things that really annoy you. They make you angry. They could make you angry. It may be other people. It may be what people are saying. It may be you have friends or associates, and you listen to what they say and you disagree with them, or you just find that you have a completely different approach. And if you're not careful, this Sun quincunx Mars could turn into something of a power struggle. And who's going to win this power struggle? I don't think anyone is going to win. And this past struggle nonetheless could be very disruptive. And as it's a quincunx rather than a square or an opposition, it shouldn't be about winners or losers. It should be about integrating something into yourself. And it might well be, Aries, that the things that make you most angry are the things that you should be integrating into your life. And so what is annoying you? If, for example, someone says something political, or they express an opinion that annoys you, then perhaps part of the reason for the annoyance is that at some level you think they've got a point. And so rather than get annoyed, this might be something that you need to explore. Try to be objective. And I think you can be objective because, as I said at the beginning of this piece on Aries, it can be a good day for communication. The moon is making a trine to the sun. But you have to use that trine properly. The moon is in Gemini. The moon in Gemini is about variety. It's about flexibility. It's about the mind. It's not about the heart. And so you've got these two solar aspects: moon trine the sun, and Mars quincunx the sun. And in a way, you should try to use both aspects. But in terms of how you're seen and how other people relate to you, try to focus on that moon trine sun. It is about balance, and it does give you the opportunity to find balance. And also, Aries, maybe you should be aware of your own limitations. You can't be an expert on everything. So that's one aspect of your limitations. And it might well be that you come across someone who knows more than you do. That might not be a permanent state. You can perhaps bridge this gap through reading or discussion, but that is possible. And if that is the case, just accept the situation. You can't be a complete expert and on every single subject. And if you come across someone who knows more than you, then you should be happy. You should be able to learn from the experience. And so it's not really about egos. It shouldn't be about egos. And likewise with a political argument or an economic argument, you haven't got all the facts. So if you can be a little bit distant, certainly on an emotional level, that might be a good idea. Yet discussions and conversations can have an impact, even if they're quite sort of light. And one impact they can have is that you can get insights into what another person is like. And there is perhaps a certain sense, as there was yesterday, but today it might be stronger. There might be a certain sense of something coming to an end today. And you just feel it. And this might come through a conversation. You're talking to someone, it's very civilized, but you kind of realize that you don't really want to talk to this person anymore. You've seen enough. You've seen the kind of person they are. They may not be a bad person, but they just might not be the right person for you at this moment in time. They're not the kind of person you should be spending time with. And it's a quiet realization, or rather it should be a quiet realization. And you don't have to make a big deal about it. You make a mental note that this thing has come to an end. And it may not be a person, it just may be a scene or a situation is coming to an end. And it's natural, it's organic, and you don't have to make a fuss about it. Taurus. Venus is making a sextile to Pluto. It's also making a semi-square to Mercury. So two aspects involving Venus. And these two aspects have somewhat different meanings. A Venus sextile Pluto is fortunate. It's about you, it's about your charisma, it's about how you present yourself. And with Venus sextile Pluto, you can have an influence, and you can have an influence in an incredibly subtle way. You don't have to make a special effort to be seen and heard. You don't have to demand that people listen to you. You just have to be yourself, not worry too much if you're not apparently being noticed. Just be there, and all the while people are noticing you, and slowly things are moving your way. And this is a subtle process, though, and for some Taurians it might be unbearably subtle. You want to move things on, you want to be seen and heard, you want to get attention, and you might be tempted to do something or say something to move things along. But if you try to force the pace, you'll lose the opportunity. You're strongest in a way when you're not being noticed, when you're hardly being noticed, and all the while you're able to have an impact, and your charisma is working. And so that's one aspect. But then we've also got Venus semi-square Mercury, and this semi-square between Venus and Mercury does represent a little bit of a struggle, and it may be about your struggle to say something or to express what you are good at. Venus and Mercury as a pair are about, or can be about, ability and being able to make something in an artistic sense, or it might be about entrepreneurial ability. It's a very talented pair, Mercury and Venus, but they are in semi-square aspect with each other, and that means it's not entirely easy. You know what you're good at, but at the same time, are people noticing you? And that might feed into Venus sextile Pluto. I said that with Venus sextile Pluto, you shouldn't be desperate to get attention. Just because you appear not to be recognized doesn't mean you're not being recognized. You might very well be recognized with Mercury semi-square Venus, and people are seeing what you can do, and they are appreciating it, but they're not making it clear, and that might make you somewhat irritated. And so, Taurus, I would really suggest that you're not in too much of a hurry to get attention, to get praise. It's happening naturally. So what do you do? Well, you could say with Mercury semi-square Venus, you take an honest look at yourself and your various activities, and you just keep going with them. You do what you're good at. If you're not being noticed, don't worry. You will in the end get the praise you deserve. And turning to the moon is making a trine to the sun. It's also making a conjunction to Jupiter, and that trine to the sun, conjunction to Jupiter, does work well for you, and it does allow you to make really good progress, especially if you're working, if you have a business. You're concerned about what kind of attention you're getting. Again, as I've said, you are getting favourable attention even if you don't think you are. And if you just get on with it, and that moon trine sun, it could be a financial dimension to it, in a good sense of the word. financial benefits are possible, and you just have to not be too demanding, but just through your efforts you can actually do something which does improve your financial position. Just keep going, and just don't take anything too seriously, and don't try to force any issue. That is going to be, very important today, and it's important to also to be tolerant and not to be put off. So you might have your ambitions, you might want to get things done, and it may feel that there's someone trying to undermine you. Maybe they say something, or you feel they don't listen to you hard enough, and that could make you annoyed, but you just have to take it in your stride, and don't get too heavily involved in any one thing. And then I do think that things can actually run very smoothly, and you can get to the places you want to go to. Gemini. The moon is trine the sun, Gemini, and I would regard that trine between the moon and the sun as working very well for you. In fact, it's not just trine the sun, it's trine Mercury as well. So with moon trine Mercury and moon trine the sun, and with moon moving through your sign, it's a day when things should work, provided you're open-minded. Don't have any preset ideas about the way things should be going, because that would just make things complicated. And be always open to consider any possibility, and don't think that the world you saw yesterday is the world you're going to see today, because there are a few subtle changes, and I do think that these changes work for the best. And so that's one way of looking at things. With this, with the moon trine Mercury moon trine sun. So just don't take things too seriously is one way of looking at it. The moon is in Gemini. Always try to be quick on your mental feet, if you like, being able to move from one subject to the other, and not being tied to any particular opinion. Having said that, there may be points of complication today which simply cannot be avoided. And that relates to a couple of aspects involving Mercury. Firstly, Mercury is semi-square Venus. Secondly, Mercury is semi-sextile Saturn. So Mercury semi-square Venus, it's a tense aspect, 45 degrees. And that might mean Mercury semi-square Venus that you can't get on with everyone. Mercury semi-square Venus, that might be someone who conflicts with you. Venus in Aries may represent a person with strong opinions, a person who has ideas you disagree with. So that's a way in which Mercury semi-square Venus could work. It might also be a struggle on your part to create something of lasting artistic and creative value. It may be something you just want to do, but it's not entirely easy. And we all have it. If you're a Gemini, Geminis have great ideas, brilliant ideas, because I would say that, having my sun in Gemini. But the problem is, how do you actually bring these things down to earth? When I think about my ideas, I don't know about you, but one thing that kind of really annoys me is that I can't write. I mean, I can write sort of non-fiction. I mean, I can string a sentence together, but I can't write fiction. I can't do it. I have tried. I'm hopeless at it. I'm just too matter of fact. And likewise, I have minimal artistic skill. When I was at school, I think I was 13, I had an art report, and the art report, it simply had 3 words. And the art teacher simply said, "A poor drawer." And that was it. And I was quite taken aback by that. But it would be so nice if I was able to write fiction or to paint pictures, because I'd be great, because I've got these wonderful ideas, but these ideas never find a way of manifesting, because I don't have the means in which to do it. And with novels, I come up with all sorts of wonderful ideas for novels, but it can't happen because I can't write fiction. And that might be Mercury semi-square Venus. You've got something that in your mind that is really important. It sounds wonderful with Mercury semi-square Venus. It sounds great, but the challenge is to actually bring it out into the open, to get people to listen, to get people to accept it, to indeed turn it into something which is aesthetically satisfying to a larger audience. It is a struggle, but it doesn't mean to say it's a struggle that you can't win. With the right effort, and if you get the right tools, then Gemini, I think you can show the world a little bit of your brilliance, and they will appreciate it. So it takes some work, that Mercury semi-square Venus, but do the work, and you should be able to find a satisfactory solution to the problem. And then we've got Mercury semi-sextile Saturn. So Mercury at 18 Aquarius, Saturn at 18 Pisces, so they're exactly 30 degrees apart. 30-degree aspects tend to be a little bit stressful, and Saturn might represent an authority figure, or the rules, or some way of establishing your presence. Somehow you want to establish your presence, but Mercury is who you are, and it's difficult to deal with it. Something does seem to be holding you back, and how do you get the world to take you seriously? Or is the world being too demanding? Are certain people being too demanding? And it might be that Mercury semi-sextile Saturn might be asking you in a way to grow up. And that might sound a patronizing thing to say, but of course I'm talking to myself as well, so maybe I can afford to say that. But with Mercury sextile Saturn, in some areas, being more mature, perhaps you've taken things too lightly. Some Geminis, maybe I have that problem. If you don't take things seriously in life, you never come to much, and I'm always aware of that. It really bothers me. I feel I've sort of fallen victim for that trap. And Mercury semi-sextile Saturn is asking you to take yourself seriously. And if there is a limitation, if you are being criticized, or if you feel small, maybe there's a reason for that. And at the same time, you just have to hold on to your vision, because you do have a vision at the moment with Mercury in Aquarius, and it's a very important vision, and hold on to it. And it may just be, Gemini, that it needs to be structured. And one final thing, Gemini, some of you, or should I say some of us, with my Sun in Gemini, may be tempted to fall into a spiral of negative thinking and starting to think perhaps the worst. And the reason for this is it is a midpoint that Mercury is on, and so you can see it. There is a Mars-Saturn midpoint. You see, there's a Mars-Saturn trine forming, and this Mars-Saturn trine is exact over the weekend. And so the Mars-Saturn midpoint, Saturn is at 18 Pisces, Mars at 18, 19 Cancer. The midpoint is 18, 19 Taurus. And Mercury is at 18 Aquarius. So Mercury is square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And as a result of that aspect, there is a danger of negativity. It just could be extreme negativity. Convincing yourself that nothing is going anywhere, that it really is all hopeless. And alternatively, there could be thoughts of death and destruction, and you look around you and it all seems to be grim. And I would suggest that you try to ignore those feelings, avoid those feelings. That's one way of looking at it. Alternatively, this is a time when you just accept it. You see the world in which you're living, and some of your negativity is, a lot of it is not about you. It's just you're being realistic, and this may also be reflected in what you say. You're able to discuss the darker sides of life, things that other people don't want to talk about, and this is especially the case with Moon trine Mercury. The words flow, but be careful who you're talking to. Some people don't want to hear. Some people just want to know, that just want to feel that everything's fine. But not you, Gemini. You're able to discuss most things, including things that many people don't want anything to do with. Cancer. With the moon continuing to move through Gemini, you might feel that it's a day when you can be largely undisturbed and you can just do what you want, because no one's going to tell you what to do. Do things your way, and don't worry. I mean, that might be the right approach. And the moon, while it's moving through Gemini, makes a trine to the sun, and it doesn't really matter what signs that the sun and the moon are in. I mean, in this case, it's the moon is in Gemini, trine the sun in Aquarius. But the point is, the moon and the sun are in a fortunate relationship with one another, and because of that, Cancerians should feel supported, even if there is apparently no one out there to give you support. I mean, there might be, but even if there isn't anyone, it doesn't matter. You just feel a sense of comfort, and you don't have to worry, and it doesn't matter what's happening out there in the world. You just know that things are working, and you're just comfortable in your space. And if you're feeling comfortable in your space, why take things further? There is a square between the moon and Saturn, and this square between moon and Saturn could, I suppose, represent some kind of conflict. But moon square Saturn might be optional. Especially if you see Saturn as being another person. So some people could be a problem. They could make life difficult for you. They could restrict you. They could even tell you what to do and what not to do. But do you have to have them around? I don't think you do. It is a matter of choice. And the last aspect the moon makes, the last major aspect the moon makes in Gemini, it does make it does make aspects in the end to, for example, there's a square to Neptune, but the last major aspect to a traditional planet is moon trine sun. So that means that whatever the problems of moon square Saturn, I do think that moon trine sun eventually will overwhelm it. And so your position at the end of Friday is one that is essentially fortunate, and you can feel comfortable, and you need to do everything you can to make yourself feel comfortable. Does that mean that you have to do nothing on Friday? No, there is an optionality to Friday, and Venus is making a sextile to Pluto, and Venus sextile Pluto means that if you want, you can be noticed, and you can be noticed without having to make much of an effort. And that's especially if you're working today on Friday. You're very clear with that Venus in Aries about who you are, what you want, how you present yourself, and because of the sextile to Pluto, you get attention, and people are interested in your opinions, and they want to know what you want, they want to know who you are, and possibly they feel also that it's important to be on the right side of you. You're that kind of person at the moment. And so that means people are going to make a special effort. And they're certainly not going to want to do anything to risk your anger or your displeasure with that Venus sextile Pluto. But that Venus sextile Pluto just doesn't seem to me to require much effort on your part, provided you're just very clear about yourself and what you want. And you don't have to tell people what you want. You have to just let it be part of who you are. And it's all very, very comfortable. So Cancer, on the surface, it seems to be a day where not a great deal is happening. But if you put yourself in the right position and you have self-confidence, then everything will start to align around you. So it can be a day where you can be at the center. You can be at the center of things, without having to try. Leo, you are quite interested in other people, and I think that your social life appears to be going quite well, because there is a trine between the moon and the sun. And the sun is in Aquarius, remember. Aquarius is a sign which is very socially orientated, and with the moon trine sun, you do have a natural ability to get on with people as a group. As individuals, that might not be quite so easy, because the moon does make a trine to the sun. The moon also makes a square to Saturn, so you can't expect to get on with everyone, and it might be that there's someone who you normally get on with okay, but for one reason or another you just don't see eye to eye with them. So don't get heavily sidetracked by any one person today with that moon square Saturn, because if you do, that might spoil things from a social perspective. And at the same time, there may just be something about you, in spite of your social skills, which is something about you which is a little bit negative. And you can partake in what other people are doing. You can appear to be in reasonable spirits, but deep down, you're just feeling that things are a little bit difficult, and that things might not get better, and you're wondering, should you be preparing yourself? Now, it just might be that you're tuning into something going on around you which may not be positive, and you are correctly identifying a problem. You might not fully want to recognize this problem, but you know it's there. And so this negativity might have real grounding, though I don't think it's about you. I think it's just about other people and what's happening in the world around you, it doesn't seem to be great. And that's one aspect of what's happening today. And also the Sun is making a quincunx to Mars. So Sun quincunx to Mars could be quite a dangerous aspect. And it's certainly not a time for Leos to be taking risks or to be doing anything stupid. And whatever you're doing, you have to consider what could go wrong, and that might be where your negativity comes in use. If you have negative feelings, then you have these negative feelings for a reason. They're warning you. It may be somewhere you're going which could mess you up. It could be other people. Not everyone is your friend. Some people could just be a real problem. And Leo, at the moment, you have the opportunity to be really aware of it and to take the required precautions. Yeah, you can do it. And the question then is, Leo, to what extent do you impose your negativity onto other people? And I've said that from a social point of view, today should be fine. If you want it to be fine, things run relatively smoothly. You know how to get on with people, but there may come a point where you feel you just have to start to move things in a more serious direction. Maybe if you talk to someone for 5 minutes, things can be light and free and friendly. But if you talk to someone for longer, then more material has to be discussed. And in the end, your own doubts and reservations come to the surface. And do you discuss them, or do you just move away? I mean, some people don't want bad news. They don't want any negativity. And so if you impose too much negativity on them, they might run away. And you have to get the balance right. And it just might be, Leo, it's a time where you have to choose your company. Not everyone is going to appreciate you entirely. Some people might find you in the end to be too much. And if things get serious, if conversations get serious with Sun quincunx Mars, there just might be a disagreement. And what is that disagreement going to be about? Now, Sun quincunx Mars could be about a clash of personalities. I mean, the Sun and Mars are they're very strong. They're two strong planets, which in their own way are quite weak at the moment. Sun is in Aquarius. Sun is in its detriment. Mars is in Cancer. Mars is fallen because Mars is exalted in Capricorn. And Mars is retrograde. So these two fairly weak planets, Sun and Mars, make this quincunx. And what it might be is that people may be touchy, you may be touchy, they understand their weaknesses, they project their weaknesses, they don't want to be challenged, they feel vulnerable, therefore they have to make a special effort to apparently safeguard their best interests. But an alternative way of looking at that Sun quincunx Mars would be to say that there is actually a constructive relationship possible between the two planets. Especially as both planets are in signs in which they're not happy, Sun in Aquarius, Mars in Cancer. And it could be that we're talking about two people who, one way or another, are in a weak position, and they can help each other out. They can actually fill in the gaps. And so try to be constructive and creative when dealing with certain people. Certain people might feel, as far as you're concerned, it might feel that they really are threats, but they might not be threats at all. And if you feel threatened or if your ego feels undermined by another person, just ask yourself what's going on. And it just might be that an apparent conflict is actually the beginnings of some kind of alliance, some mutually supporting alliance. So that is certainly possible. Virgo. Negativity is a word that I have been using from time to time today in my readings for the 12 signs. And the issue relates to the trine between Mars and Saturn. So Mars and Saturn are forming a trine. This trine is exact over the weekend, and this trine has a midpoint. So you've got Saturn at 18 Pisces, or 19 Pisces, Mars at 19 Cancer, the midpoint 18-19 Taurus, and that means that both the Sun and Mercury are square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And that's causing a certain amount of havoc in terms of making things difficult, people having fears, and it just may be that it appears that things are going from bad to worse. Must emphasize, I'm not talking about anything personal. I'm just talking about the way things are, the world in which we're living. It's not specific to you, Virgo, but it might feel specific to you because Mercury, which is your ruler, of course, is square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So with Mercury square the Mars-Saturn midpoint, that can be about negative thoughts, feeling that things aren't going to work, perhaps trying to persuade yourself that there is no point. And some of that negativity might have good grounds. It might actually be real. I mean, we're living in difficult times, and you, of all people, are just completely aware of that. And so many people are thinking, what is the point? What is the point of trying, because things are just collapsing around us? And that means, Virgo, you have to be careful how you express yourself. It's always good to be cautious, and it's always good to demonstrate that caution. But if you get into a spiral of negativity, that might not be appreciated. And you should try, as far as is possible, to look at the positives as well as the negatives. And there are things to be positive about. Mercury is making a trine to the moon. The moon, moon earlier on made a conjunction to Jupiter. It's making Mercury. The moon is making a trine to Mercury. So, moon trine Mercury, there is a lot you can say, and there's a lot you can say which could be uplifting. But that moon trine Mercury might just encourage you to communicate, and it might encourage you to communicate your reservations in an entirely negative way. And that means, Virgo, that you have to sort of resolve the contradiction. If you can see what could go wrong, if you can see all the problems around you, then perhaps that is just something you need to communicate. But you need to do it in a constructive way. For example, saying it can be done, but we have to recognize that the situation is not ideal, and what do we do about it? For example, I mean, that is certainly one approach. And this realism, it does underline the day, and it's kind of interesting that there are no planets in Earth signs except for Uranus. Now, you could say that that might make a lot of people unrealistic, not particularly grounded, but you, Virgo, you are being hyper-realistic. And it may be one reason that you're being hyper-realistic is because you know there are no earth signs, at least at an unconscious level. And so you're responding to this. There's nothing to ground yourself on, so that does make things extra problematic. And Mercury is making a semi-square to the Saturn. So it's not just the fact that Mercury is square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It's actually sorry, did I say semi-square? I said semi-sextile Saturn. So Mercury semi-sextile Saturn, 30 degrees from Saturn. There are things holding you back. And it may be other people, maybe certain other people are not good for you. They're just encouraging your negativity. And maybe you're encouraging their negativity. So, who do you want to spend time with? Some people are better than others. And Mercury is not just semi-sextile Saturn, it's also semi-square Venus. Again, Mercury semi-square Venus is about a bit of a struggle. Venus may represent something that you are trying to work on, and it's important to you, and you may just be concerned that right now, short term, it's not really happening. And there may be a certain amount of frustration there with Mercury semi-square Venus. I mean, that's looking at Mercury semi-square Venus in a negative sense. But it is actually a very creative aspect. And it is saying, Virgo, that if you really work on something, even if at first it doesn't seem to be happening, if it just seems to be really difficult, if you keep working on it and you keep trying something new and you keep being positive, but also being realistic at the same time, then, in the end, Virgo, it does seem that you can sort of sort the problem out. So, Virgo, I'm sorry to sound a little bit negative, but what I'm kind of suggesting is that you need to be able to sort of accept the negativity, but use it and not feel overwhelmed by it. Libra. There is a trine between the Sun and the Moon today, and this trine is in air signs. You've got Moon in Gemini, and you've got Sun in Aquarius, and trines between the Sun and the Moon are good news. And when that trine between the Sun and the Moon is in air signs, that's good news for Libra, because Moon in Gemini trines Libra, your sign, the whole sign, and likewise Sun in Aquarius trines Libra. In fact, the Moon doesn't just trine the Sun; it trines Mercury, and this means, Libra, that you can have an underlying belief in yourself, and you will get evidence, I think, that things are going in your favor, and you should maybe regard yourself as being fortunate in this sense. I do think a lot of people are having a difficult day, but Libra, I don't think you need to have a difficult day. I do believe that with the right attitude, you can really take advantage of the prevailing planetary energy, and if you start putting effort into something, then it should increasingly flow. It should increasingly move your way. But don't think too much about the future. I think with this Moon trine Sun, it is important to live in the present and to concentrate on things which are life-affirming, not just for your own good, but also for other people's good. Because, as I've just said, people have a rather negative view of the world. A lot of people do. And if you can be positive, then people are going to really appreciate that, and it's going to allow you to have an influence, and you'll be helped by the fact that Venus is sextile Pluto, with this Venus sextile Pluto, you can understand people, you can understand what's bothering them, and in your own quiet way you can take action to transform the situation, make things better, and make everyone feel sort of more alive. Now, that might sound like a situation that is high pressure, a lot of responsibility, but it needn't be any work. Moonshine Sun is not about hard work. It's just about just letting things flow, letting things go their way, and don't feel that everything has to be absolutely perfect. The moon does make a square to Saturn, and just before it makes a trine to Sun, and so with that moon square Saturn, there might be some small detail that you could obsess about, and that could spoil things, but it needn't happen. So if you hit a problem, just try to keep moving and don't obsess about it. And usually, if you just keep going, then the problem will fade into the distance, or even if it doesn't fade into the distance, you'll be able to deal with it at a later stage. So don't allow anything like that to interfere with your flow. And from a social perspective, looking at some of the personalities in your life at the moment, Sun quincunx Mars. Not everyone is happy. Sun quincunx Mars, they really aren't, and it might be that someone you know is feeling sorry for themselves, or they might feel that they desperately need attention. So that's Sun quincunx Mars. The two male planets, Sun and Mars, in making this difficult aspect, making this quincunx. Of course, Mars is ruler of Aries, your opposite sign. So there are a couple of people who might be struggling with their emotions and having fairly strong feelings and being a little bit angry. And it does matter that you don't get sidetracked. That is an important point today. You have a smooth road ahead, but there could be a couple of distractions that could mess things up. And one distraction, could be a person who is angry, who wants attention, maybe even demands attention. But you don't have to fall for it. You can just take the whole thing in your stride, and maybe you can make some suggestions, because Sun quincunx Mars could represent just a person who is struggling, and maybe, as far as you're concerned, the solution to the problem could be absolutely obvious, and maybe you just have to tell them what the problem is and what they need to do about it, and then just move on. Scorpio. I was just talking to Libra, and I was mentioning the fact that the Sun is making a quincunx to Mars. The Sun is 150 degrees from Mars. And this is an aspect that might be important for you. Simply because Mars is your ruler, and Mars is quincunx for Sun, and the Sun and Mars are these two planets. Okay, I know technically the Sun is not a planet, it's a star, but we'll treat it as a planet. Sun and Mars are these two planets that have a stressful aspect with one another, that can't entirely relate, and it might then be the case, Scorpio, that you feel a little bit angry. Something is just annoying you. It's not right. And it might feel as if it's really quite fundamental. And you try your hardest to understand it, but it just keeps getting at you. And it might just all seem to be a pain. But this Sun quincunx Mars, it's there for a reason. And on a psychological level, there appears to be something that you are trying to integrate, two very strong principles which don't make sense, and neither one will go away. And both principles have something about them which is quite compelling, that just can't be ignored. And so you are struggling, and the struggle would be made more difficult if other people are involved. It's possible that the Sun represents another person, possibly someone you know very well. You know them so well that you can't get rid of them. You can't distance them. You can't distance them from you, and so you have to put up with them. But they might be making life miserable, or it may not be a person. It just may be a situation. Just something is just upsetting the flow, and the question is, what do you do about it? It is a quincunx, and a quincunx is about the struggle for integration, to bring something into line, make it part of your life. And so what you have to do is you have to really take these two principles, which are so different from one another, which seem contradictory, and somehow find the common ground and really work on it. And if you make the effort and you are rational and you are mature, then I do think, Scorpio, you can actually make the link, you can make the connection. If the Sun is another person, you might be talking about a person who is, in her own way, quite weak. And they've got things going on for them which really haven't been very helpful, and they could be projecting their weakness onto you, and it might be making them angry. But in terms of your response, another person's weakness and how they express their weakness is kind of reminding you of your own weaknesses. And it could be the case that you and another person can help each other out. And it might not feel like that to begin with. You both have things you're working with. You both have things that you're trying to resolve. And neither of you have all the resources you need. So that Sun quincunx Mars could just be about sharing resources with another person, balancing your strengths and weaknesses. It's not an easy process, but I do think that it is actually something that you can do, and you have to be very realistic about it. Though another reason why you might be a little bit tense, Scorpio, is because you're starting to become aware that something is coming to an end, is coming to a close, and you may have been involved with something for a long time, and it has gone as far as it can, and this is the end of a road. If you keep going with it, then you're not going to make any progress. Yeah, you could just make yourself annoyed. So it might be a good idea to contemplate what it means to end something. It may be ending a stage in your life. It may be about ending an activity you have been involved with for a long time. Or it could be about ending a connection with another person. So do think about endings. And Endings may be necessary, because if you don't end something, then you can't have a new start. And as we know with Scorpio, transformation is very important, and moving from one thing to another. And there's a lot of action, then there's silence, there's quiet. And in the quiet, you transform. And this could say something about what's happening at the moment. With the Sun in Aquarius, we've got Sun, Pluto, Mercury in Aquarius, in this part of your chart that's quite hidden. And so this may be just a time of year when you feel you don't need to always be available, when you can work on yourself and start getting ready for a new future, which sort of might happen, maybe when the sun moves into Pisces in less than a fortnight. So I think, Scorpio, it is quite a serious time, but don't be too negative about things. I mean, negativity is an issue for all the 12 signs, and how we deal with negativity. And in terms of other people, we know there are mixed messages. Some people can be useful. Some people can really cooperate with you, and perhaps you can share resources with them. But there is also this sense of ending, and maybe some things really are coming to a close. Sagittarius. Sagittarius, you have a great sense of yourself still. I think you do. And you have a sense of what can be done, and you can also understand what's bothering people. And so if you are out and about, then you're definitely going to have something to contribute, and your ability to step into another person's shoes could actually be stronger than usual. And so if anyone's got something that's bothering them, you'll know about it, and you might be in a position to go some way towards sorting the problem out. And how do you sort a problem out? It may just be having a different view, a different perception, taking something that is serious, and many people do regard today as being quite a serious day, and demonstrating that it's not that serious, that it may be something that can just be laughed at. And levity might really matter, especially when we've got the moon trine the sun, moon trine sun, and also the moon conjunct Jupiter does allow you to be enthusiastic, to look at possibilities, and to be able to communicate in a way that is really very uplifting. And that's perhaps your role, to cheer people up and to make people become aware of real possibilities. And so consider everyone around you, consider everyone who you have dealings with today, and don't look at things on the surface. Ask yourself, what is this person trying to express? What might be bothering this person? And it will become clear. Very quickly, you'll just have an intuition about what is going on. And with that intuition, you'll then be in a position to maybe do something to just create change. It just might be just something you say, something you do, just changes everything, and it changes everything for the better. So that's perhaps what the day is about. and you are, to an extent, at other people's disposal. Well, not quite. You have to look after yourself and your own interests, and you don't want to be dragged down. I mean, that is the problem, isn't it? I mean, if you spend too much time with other people, if you spend too much time trying to make them feel better about themselves, then your own boundaries might become porous and you might become a little bit overwhelmed. And it is true that some people are just being overly negative. Mercury, which is ruler of Gemini, your opposite sign, is making a semi-sextile to Saturn. And that Mercury semi-sextile Saturn could represent a person who has a very single-minded and negative view of the way things should be, and that they might not be in the mood for compromise, and they might want to drag you in. So you can't give people everything, and you can't go beyond certain limits. So you give people some of your time, but you shouldn't be giving people all of your time. And it might be the case that things going on in your home or in terms of your family might be a little bit debilitating. So if family members want a lot of your attention, then that might be cause for concern. So Sagittarius, it really does matter that there is movement. You want to be moving to some extent all the time. You don't want to be stuck in one place, especially with that Mercury semi-sextile Saturn. That Mercury semi-sextile Saturn could be problematic, and it's just about another person just not letting go, and maybe not wanting to let go of you. So Sagittarius, it's always going to be important today that you keep your options open. Capricorn, Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Saturn, and this semi-sextile, it might seem a somewhat minor aspect. I mean, semi-sextile, it's 30 degrees. So, I mean, you just had Sun semi-sextile Saturn, is that right? Yeah, the Sun has just passed the semi-sextile Saturn. I think that was yesterday. Now you've got Mercury semi-sextile Saturn. So you could say that it's sort of part of the same movement, the Sun-Mercury conjunction making that semi-sextile to Saturn. But with Mercury semi-sextile Saturn, that could represent words, actions, movements that you might find irritating. Mercury might just be about a person talking too much, and that could be upsetting your equilibrium. It can happen. You've got your day planned, and someone calls you, and they've got problems, and they regard their problems as being the most important thing in the world, and they just keep going, and 2 hours have gone, and they're still talking. I mean, so that could be a way in which Mercury semi-sextile Saturn might work, and it just might also be about details that you really don't want to have to deal with. Perhaps you'd decided that you were going to deal with these things later, but they're thrown upon you, and suddenly you have to concentrate on them, and you're not in the mood. It's not what you want to do, but you find yourself having to do it. And this might then mean, Capricorn, that your time is not necessarily respected. maybe it's other people disrespecting your time. You might also feel that the universe is disrespecting your time just by presenting you things that you're not very comfortable with, that as far as you're concerned, they could be dealt with someone else. They shouldn't be your problem, but they have become your problem, and you just get annoyed. And so Capricorn, it just matters that you keep in mind your priorities. You have priorities. You know that certain things need to be done. It's not a day when things need to be spectacular, though you're certainly able to have an impact verbally. I mean, it is a verbal day, and it's not just other people talking too much. You're quite able to assert yourself verbally. In fact, you can use words today with considerable skill, and your ability to argue and to make a point is going to be very obvious. So if you're a Capricorn lawyer, then today should be great, and you're going to be able to present your anger in a very verbal way. So without losing your cool, you can explain your annoyance, and it may not just be annoyance to people getting in your way. It may be about advocacy. If there's something you feel is important and needs to be argued for, Capricorn, then I've no doubt that you can do it. You will be very effective, and you won't miss out anything, because at the moment, Capricorn, your sense of detail is extremely good, and this might relate to money. So if you have to argue about money or talk about money, you might not want to, but if you find yourself having to talk about money or trying to argue your case or someone else's case in a financial sense, again, I think you'll do a really good job. It will be really effective, and you're also going to be helped by the fact that Mars is starting to make a trine to Saturn, and this Mars trine Saturn is pretty close. At noon Friday New York time, Mars is at 1845 Cancer, Saturn is at 1810 Pisces. So Mars, well, then of course Mars is going retrograde, so Mars will go backwards over the weekend to make the exact trine. But today, Mars trine Saturn, it's about the constructive use of anger. That's Mars. Mars gets annoyed about things, and annoyance can so easily get out of control, but Saturn creates that structure. So when you put the whole thing together, Capricorn, you are not someone to mess with today, especially on a verbal level. Aquarius. The Sun and the Moon are in trine aspect. We've got the Sun in Aquarius, Moon in Gemini, and also the Moon is actually making a trine to Mercury in Aquarius. So these aspects are fortunate, and they are particularly fortunate for Aquarians. And it reminds you that the Sun is moving through your sign. The Sun is highlighting your sign. This is a time of year when Aquarians should be in a position where they can really make things happen, and they can have a clear sense of who they are and what they want and what makes them special. And Moon trine Sun really allows you to bring the whole thing out into the open and really to do what you want. It is a day that should be about you. It's not about other people. It's what you want, and so that's what you should be aiming for. And at the same time, Aquarius, if you have interactions with the world, I'm confident that you're going to be very effective. You will know how to present yourself, you'll know how to argue your case, and there's just something about you that is really difficult to ignore, or should I say difficult to avoid. If there's something that needs to be said, then Aquarians are certainly going to be able to say it, and you shouldn't allow outside distractions to get in your way and without comment, because you've always got something to say, and your comments will be powerful. And also we have a sextile between Venus and Pluto. Venus in Aries, sextile Pluto in Aquarius. So Venus sextile Pluto does make you, I would have said, quite attractive. You're someone who is noticed, and the things you say will not just get attention, but they will also win hearts and minds. So if there's something that you want to persuade people about, or persuade a person about, then now might be your chance. And there's a small sense of drama here with this Venus sextile Pluto. I mean, Venus sextile Pluto is a fairly minor aspect, but it does have a certain dramatic feel to it. And with Venus sextile Pluto, you might be able to present something unexpectedly, do something that people weren't expecting, or even appear somewhere that you were not expected. A surprise guest, maybe. And yeah, if you can do that, you will have an immediate impact. And it's important that you don't get caught up in other people's dramas. That might happen because there is a quincunx aspect between the Sun and Mars, and also there's a semi-sextile between Mercury and Saturn. And so the quincunx between the Sun and Mars might represent another person, maybe a partner, someone you're in some kind of relationship with. Quincunx Mars, they could be annoyed about something, and there is a possibility that they try to draw you into their annoyance. And instead you need to have some kind of distance, some kind of objectivity here, because if you allow yourself to be drawn into another person's problem, well, at the very least that could waste a lot of time. Also, Mercury semi-sextile Saturn. Saturn represents you, Mercury represents a distractor, I think. You are not the only person capable of creating surprises. Someone else might create a surprise by something they say, and what they say might not be what you were expecting. And with that Mercury semi-sextile Saturn, it's important that you don't overreact, and that you don't allow another person to set the pace. I mean, that would be unnecessary, because at a sort of verbal and intellectual level, it is a day, Aquarius, where you should be in control. You should be the one who is making things happen. Pisces. The moon continues to move through Gemini, and in the Pisces chart, Gemini is a sign which is about grounding. It's about concentrating on what is important right now. And the moon is trine the sun, and so the sun is moving through Aquarius, and so with that moon trine sun, ideally, Pisces, things should be relatively quiet. You don't want a lot of noise today. It's not going to be helpful, and I don't think that you need much in the way of excitement. Moon trine Sun is an easygoing aspect. It should be an easygoing aspect, which helps you to settle down. And it is the end of a week. I suppose you're moving into the weekend. Maybe you want to have a weekend early. Maybe this is Friday. You've had enough, and it might then be the case that you have to work hard to make sure that your peace of mind and your stability are not undermined by what other people say and do, particularly say. I mean, Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Saturn, and so Mercury semi-sextile Saturn could represent some kind of disturbance. Perhaps you're presented with something or somebody that you don't really want to deal with. You feel that there might be a certain obligation to deal with this person, and in the process you could undermine your peace of mind. And you want peace of mind, and it's so important that you don't overreact, that you take people's words as just words. You don't try too hard to work out what the hidden meaning is. Trying to play psychological guessing games, that's just going to use up precious resources, and that's just something that you don't want. And instead, just listen to whatever anyone has to say, but don't take it too seriously, and put your own interest first. And that's really how you should be going about things. And if you want a day that is completely undramatic, then I think you can have that day, and you deserve to have that day. And there are still things that you believe you need to sort of think through, or should I say feel through, and the fewer distractions there are, the better. There is a square between Moon and Saturn, though, today, and this square between Moon and Saturn might make you feel that there is some aspect of your home and domestic environment that isn't perfect, and it might feel as if you want to really look at it in detail. But it might be a situation, the more you look at something, the more you try to look at something close up, the less sense it makes. And so maybe that moon square Saturn should just be ignored, and you should focus on that moon trine Sun. That moon trine Sun is all about harmony, finding harmony, and just being aware of threats to that harmony. The threats are there, but I think the threats can be ignored, and largely ignored, and don't take any one person too seriously. And those are my forecasts for Friday, and I now want to look at things from a perspective of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 17, which is following. And it is all about following something, or it might actually be about looking for something. There's something we want to get hold of, and we have to work at it, and we have to adopt the right approach. And with following, there is a question: are we being followed, or are we doing the following? And somehow they're both the same thing. If we want to follow something, then we find ourselves being followed. If we want to be a leader, then we have to be flexible, and we also have to be prepared to follow. So there is that balance there. And in terms of what's actually happening at the moment, we do have two moving lines, and the bottom line is moving, and it is about pursuing something. There is something we are following, something we want to get hold of, and we might be quite obsessed about it. But with this bottom line moving, there is a sense that things are changing. What was important yesterday is not necessarily important today. What we wanted to follow yesterday is not the same as today. So we might actually have to change some of our goals and recognize that we need to adjust our approach. And some of us might feel that recently our status maybe has taken a plunge, that something wasn't right and we didn't get the recognition we deserved, and that might be a sign that things were changing, that we might have temporarily found ourselves to be a little bit out of date. And with this hexagram, we need to make ourselves more relevant. And I think we can make ourselves relevant, and part of that making ourselves relevant is changing what we feel it's important to pursue, changing some of our goals, and that's the way forward. And in the process, we maybe can be looked at again, in terms of other people. They may have perceived us in one way, and that might not have been great. They might have had a sort of slightly negative view of us, and we can perhaps restore their trust. So that is a way in which this hexagram could work. And then the second hexagram moves. The second line moves, and the second line provides a certain amount of warning. We are making choices, and maybe we've got two choices. We can do this, we can do that, and which choice are we going to make? There is a danger that we make the wrong choice. We choose something because it is comfortable, because maybe it relates to the past, and if we do that, we're going to trip ourselves up. And it might also relate to who we choose to be in contact with. There may be two groups of people, or two people. One person is easiest. One person perhaps relates to the past. One person is more difficult, and we don't really know what we're doing. But probably if we do have two choices, we should always tend to focus on the more challenging of the choices, the one that encourages us to engage in personal growth. If we just continue with the past, as the previous line is suggesting, if we just go back to the past, assume that the past is always is easiest, that's where we're going to retreat, then we're not going to get anywhere. And so what we're dealing with here is a situation where we may be forcing ourselves to take on new responsibilities. We're accepting the future. We should be accepting the future. It's difficult accepting the future and accepting future challenges, especially when we consider the fact that with these two lines moving, we move to a different hexagram, and this hexagram is hexagram 47, which is opposition. And this does put us in a situation where things aren't easy, where not everyone agrees with us, but it's the right place to be. It's important that we accept our responsibilities, and that's what opposition is about. It might seem a completely negative hexagram, opposition, but you could see it as taking something on. Greg Winkup, in his translation of I Ching, he doesn't call this hexagram opposition, he calls it burdened. And by burdened, he means taking on responsibility. And that's something we have to do. It is the responsibility of the new. And letting go of things that were just too easy. We've done it before. It's the past, and we now have to accept that, the future is going to be more difficult, but we're prepared to take on the responsibilities of the future. And we do it, we might be burdened, but it's okay. We can move forward, and we can live up to these responsibilities. So it's not an easy I Ching reading, but it's an I Ching reading that is clearly giving some advice here. Focus on the future, and the future is possibly more difficult than the past, but if we try to live the past because it seems easiest, that's not the way forward. We have to accept that there is a burden that needs to be picked up. Of course, I'm not necessarily talking about a physical burden. I don't want you to pick up some heavy load and do your back in. It's more of a sort of burden of general responsibility that we have to get involved with because it's the right thing to do. And finally, I want to go back to the shooting in Sweden. My apologies if that's not something you want to talk about, or listen to about. But we do have a time of birth for him, and I think that there are a few points that also we don't have a time of birth, we have a date of birth. And turning to his chart, so here he is Rickard Andersson, born on August the 10th 1989. I don't know when he was born. I think he was born in Örebro, Sweden, close, even if he's not born there. Because I don't have a time of birth, it doesn't really make any difference. So this chart is not necessarily going to tell us very much because we don't have a time of birth. He probably has the moon in Scorpio, or had the moon in Scorpio. He probably had the moon in Scorpio. So you can see that at noon in Örebro, the moon was at 25 Scorpio. So if he was born very late in the day, the moon would have been in Sagittarius. But I think it's a fair bet that the moon was in Scorpio. I think we can say with 90% certainty that the moon was in Scorpio. So we'll go with moon in Scorpio. And a lot of people have moon in Scorpio. 1 in 12 people listening to me have the moon in Scorpio. There's nothing wrong with the moon in Scorpio. But every placement has its disadvantage. Every placement can go wrong. And moon in Scorpio is a placement that can really be brooding. It can be emotional. It can have real resentment. And that resentment can build up. And this could be the resentment of his whole life, not feeling he's getting anywhere. I think I read somewhere that he might have had Asperger's, and so his social abilities might not have been great, and sort of intellectually he failed pretty much everything. So so sort of in terms of academic achievement, things weren't working. He was unemployed. He'd been rejected for military service. I think Sweden has conscription, doesn't it? So earlier, I suppose at some stage he wasn't able to get into the military. So you can imagine there's a lot for him to be resentful about, and that moon in Scorpio might say something about it. We can't really look at any aspects between the moon and Scorpio because the moon could be anywhere. The moon could be anywhere between 19 Scorpio and 1 degree Sagittarius. It's somewhere between there. So it's difficult to know what aspects were. We don't even know what Vedic sign his moon in Scorpio would be in. From a Vedic perspective, it could be in Scorpio, it could be in Libra, so we don't know that. So we don't really know a great deal about the moon. Moon might be square the nodes. Nodes you could say the nodes would represent other people, his connections with other people. Moon in Scorpio, there's a sort of somewhat difficult connection there. And then we have the outer planets. He was born in 1989. So in 1989, around that time, we had this huge conjunction. It was this conjunction which sort of coincided with the fall of communism, the fall of the wall, and so he has certainly a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. He has Uranus at 1 degree Capricorn as well. So certainly a Saturn-Neptune conjunction there, and Chiron is opposition that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So you could say that he has Neptune on the Saturn-Chiron midpoint, or square the Saturn-Chiron midpoint. So Saturn-Neptune is about uncertainty. It's about fear. Saturn represents structure. Neptune is trying to undermine that structure. Okay, we saw that going on with the fall of communism. And so that may say something. And also he has his Mercury, his Mercury is in Virgo. Now, Mercury in Virgo, all things being equal, is quite a good place for Mercury. It's supposed to be quite intelligent. Prince Harry's got Mercury in Virgo. And we do know that, as I just said, academically things weren't great for him. He failed just about everything. And his Mercury is making a trine to Uranus. So how does this work? And there's no air in his chart, by the way. That's an important point to make. So with no air in his chart, there's nothing unintellectual, by the way, about having no air in your chart. A lot of people who have no air in their chart are highly accomplished academically. In fact, no air in their chart may actually help them become accomplished academically, because it allows them to focus. With air, you can sort of lose your focus sometimes, and you can sort of get distracted. But he has no air. He perhaps has focus, but with no air, he's perhaps finding it difficult to consider, alternative views and to question his own ideas. And still, he has got Mercury trine Uranus. He's got Mars trine Saturn. These trines have to be important. Mercury trine Uranus can be about ideas, having ideas. We don't really know what these ideas are, but these ideas brought him to the conclusion that he wanted to walk into a school with guns and with a gun. And then Mars trine Saturn. Mars Saturn as a pair could be about death and destruction. So if you've got Mars trine Saturn, it could be quite easy for him to think about concepts of death and destruction. And very easy for him to think about. It could be fantasies about death and destruction. And perhaps someone who has Mars trine Saturn is able to inflict death and destruction quite easily, because Mars is trine Saturn. And so that's an important thing going on in his chart. And Mercury links with it all. He's got Mercury trine Neptune. So we're seeing trines working, but not in a very good way. The end result for society and for him is not great. So trines in astrology can actually be a bit of a problem. Squares provide motivation. They might not be pleasant, but they're dynamic. And if it's all about trines, it's not quite so easy. Now, one outer planet opposition he has is Jupiter opposition Uranus. Now, Jupiter opposition Uranus it looks like being actually a very close Jupiter opposition Uranus. And Jupiter opposition Uranus, if it was expressed constructively, would be about the desire for freedom and release. And that seems to be a certain sense about who he was, wanting freedom, wanting a release. And that Jupiter trine Uranus is quite close to the solstice point. And so it's relevant to him, maybe, and it's certainly obviously relevant to the world. And so his freedom, his release, in the end, turns out to be this shooting. So that Jupiter opposition Uranus is in the end manifesting not really in a very constructive way. And so those are a few thoughts about his chart. It's just very difficult to say much that is useful, given the fact that we don't have a time of birth. Then there is a question of what was going on when the shooting happened, and so here is a chart for the shooting. The newspapers all say 12:33 when the police were called, but I assume it started a bit before that. So I've set the chart for 12:30, and so let's just compare the two charts. So here are the charts, and so what were the transits? What was going on? So this weekend there is an exact Mars trine Saturn, and at the time of the shooting, Mars was about 2 degrees off the trine of Saturn. Now, in Rickard Andersson's chart, he has a Mars-Saturn trine. I suspect that Mars-Saturn trine was a very important aspect for him. So there was a Mars trine Saturn energy at the time of the shooting, even though that Mars-Saturn trine doesn't directly... that's not true, actually. I'll just talk about that in a moment. I was saying that Mars trine Saturn doesn't directly impact his chart, but in fact it does, because it hits his true black moon Lilith. But the point is that he, as a Mars trine Saturn person, born with a Mars trine Saturn, might resonate to the Mars trine Saturn energy at the time of the shooting. So that's certainly one point to make. Now, Mars at 19 degrees 30 Cancer was making a square to his true black moon Lilith. Now, we don't know a great deal about that true black moon Lilith in his chart because we don't have a time of birth. But true black moon Lilith... By the way, I had a question about the issue of true black moon Lilith. Is that certain software programs, they calculate a very different position for black moon Lilith. Well, there is a mean black moon Lilith and there's a true black moon Lilith. And there can be actually a really considerable difference between the two. I am quite recent to black moon Lilith. I've only just started looking at it over the last, less than a year, because I tend to be a little bit skeptical about these kind of things. But I'm quite impressed by black moon Lilith. But I'm impressed by true black moon Lilith. I think there are problems with mean black moon Lilith, and one of the problems with mean black moon Lilith, it is mean. It is an approximation, and so I'm not even sure whether it's useful to look at exact aspects involving mean black moon Lilith. So I would prefer to use true black moon Lilith, and his true black moon Lilith might be his resentments, the past, his darkness. And Mars is making that square to his true black moon Lilith, and his sun. Now his sun is at 1745 Leo, and so we don't know, because we don't know his time of birth, but his sun will be somewhere between 1715 and 1815 Leo, so we don't know quite where his sun is. But Saturn was at 1748 Pisces, so Saturn was quincunx his sun, and quincunx aspects we often forget about, but I do think that quincunx aspects are important. And so Saturn on his sun, the sun represents him. He's a Leo. Let's not forget he's a Leo. Maybe a lot of things going wrong in his life, but he was a proud Leo. And if you're a proud Leo and you're underperforming, you're unemployed, you weren't able to get into the army, and you're having to go to this adult classes at this adult college, and you're failing everything. A lot of resentment there. And with that Saturn quincunx sun, that in this case may have been one of the triggers for the action he took. Oh, talking about Chiron, we're just talking about Black Moon Lilith. Notice that Chiron. Remember I was talking about this Chiron Mars. There was a Chiron Mars square over the last week, and this Chiron Mars square was directly impacting his Black Moon Lilith. It was bringing it all out onto the surface. Now, one aspect that he does have, when is Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And I wanted to kind of take a bit of a diversion here and just look at other people who have Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now let me just show you what I mean here. So he has Mars-Saturn, a Mars-Saturn trine. Mars at 4 degrees Virgo, Saturn at 8 degrees Capricorn. So the midpoint between Mars and Saturn is going to be 6 degrees Scorpio, and his Venus is at 21 Virgo. So Venus is semi-square his Mars-Saturn midpoint. I looked at the Mars-Saturn midpoint because he'd just done a shooting, and that's a midpoint I always look at. Mars and Saturn are the death aspect, and so what's going on? He had Venus there, and Venus, what does Venus mean? I mean, Venus may just be a personal planet on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, which makes him think about death. It could be something to do about his relationships with the opposite sex, his thoughts about the opposite sex. It could be Venus just could be his whole way he considers other human beings. And I suppose there could be something rather misanthropic about Venus aspecting a Mars-Saturn midpoint. So, which made me think, what other people, or is there a country that has Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint? Well, what do we find? Well, so this is, if you like, my diversion. And so Ukraine's became independent on August the 24th, 1991, and there is Ukraine has its Venus-Saturn midpoint, so its Mars-Saturn midpoint at around 28 Scorpio. So Venus is square Ukraine's Mars-Saturn midpoint, and in Ukraine's case, it could be about the fate of the country, what's happening to the country. It could represent other people who have damaged the country. You think of Victoria Nuland going to Kiev in 2014 and encouraging the coup against the democratically elected government. So, and Victoria Nuland, by the way, she has the Aries point on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, aspecting a Mars-Saturn midpoint. And of course, as a result of that coup, Ukraine got involved in a war, and as a result of that war, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, reminding ourselves that the Mars-Saturn aspect, it is about the death aspect. And it may represent one's attitude to people. You look at Ukraine and its attitude to its population, and mobilization, and it's trying to do what the West says. The West wants Ukraine to mobilize more people, and they just go into this meat grinder. So that might be how Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint is working in that example. And another example, which I've certainly looked at before, is that of Helga Goebbels. She's the daughter of the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, and her mother Magda Goebbels. And she had Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So where's her Mars and her Saturn? You see, she's got Venus. There's her. She has a wide Mars-Saturn opposition. So Venus is square the Mars-Saturn opposition, and so Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Venus is Venus in Scorpio. Venus in Cancer. It's quite poisonous. Of course, she died of cyanide poisoning because her mother killed her, and helped by an SS doctor. And so Venus might be the mother. Might be. I mean, she got on well with her father, but I get the impression she hated her mother, or really did not like her mother, and her suspicions were correct, because it was her mother in the end killed her, of course with her father's approval, but it was a mother who was attending to her poisoning, and she was only one of the Goebbels children that actually tried to resist, apparently, the poisoning, and because it was the cyanide capsule was sort of forced into her mouth. And so that's an example of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Camilla has Venus, Queen Camilla. She has Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. I'm not quite sure what this means. I mean, I'm not a great royal watcher, but you can see there's Camilla's Mars, Camilla's Saturn, and Venus is right in the middle. So Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. I don't know. I mean, you could say that she was partly responsible for breaking up Charles's marriage with Diana. So that could be Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It may say something about her relationships. It may say something about her relationship with Charles and the fact that Charles is ill and so forth. And so that might be it. I mean, you probably know more about Camilla than me. And Venus can also be very creative. It's what you're writing about. And the First World War poet Wilfred Owen had Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And so Venus, there's his Mars, there's his Saturn. So I think he's got Venus sesquiquadrate his Mars-Saturn midpoint. And so Venus represents art, represents poetry. And what was his poetry about? A lot of his poetry was about the horrors of the First World War, and many people in the UK regard his poems as being the most descriptive and poems of the First World War. I mean, maybe people don't read his poems anymore, but certainly when I was at school, I had to read his poems. I think a lot of British school children doing English literature courses or literature courses do come across Wilfred Owen's poems, and his anger about what's been inflicted on him, and also his anger about women. He was in that poem, Dulce et decorum est. One of his targets is this woman who was writing patriotic articles, encouraging men to join up and of course join up and go to their death, and talking about how wonderful it was to be in the army, and he's actually there looking at the horror. So that could be Venus aspecting his Mars-Saturn midpoint. So we can see so far ways in which Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint is working. Now there is another way, and talking about people who commit mass murders. Adam Lanza, who I believe Adam Lanza was on the autistic spectrum. Adam Lanza was, of course, who was responsible for the Sandy Hook killing in 2012 in Connecticut. And Adam Lanza, I don't have a time of birth for Adam Lanza, but he has Venus on the Venus semi-square, the Mars-Saturn midpoint. You see, there's his Mars, there's his Saturn, and so the Mars-Saturn midpoint would be about 3 Pisces. So Venus semi-square his Mars-Saturn midpoint, and in his case, he obviously had serious issues with people. He had serious issues with his mother, because Helga Goebbels had issues with her mother, and the first person he killed was his mother, and his mother, I think, took him shooting and so forth, and so there was a problem relationship between him and his mother. Mother was the first person to die, and then he went to the elementary school. So that's how Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint could work. And then we see pretty much the same thing with Rickard Andersson. Again, Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. A difficulty relating, as with Adam Lanza, possibly both being on the autistic spectrum. That does not mean to say that if you have got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, or as a child with Venus aspecting a Mars-Saturn midpoint, that leads to autism. I'm absolutely not saying that. I'm saying that just so happens in the case of these two people, they both did have Venus semi-square at the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and they were involved in something similar. Very different charts, I think, but they both had, they were born relatively close together, a few years apart, so they were both born with, if you look at Adam Lanza, he had the Uranus Neptune conjunction, so it was a bit different, and Saturn had moved out of Capricorn into Aquarius, but both Adam Lanza and Rickard Andersson did have this Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So if you're doing this kind of stuff and you're looking at killers and school shootings and these kind of people, always look at the Mars-Saturn midpoint, because I think it can be useful. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say about Rickard Andersson. Not a lot to go on, because I don't have his time of birth, but I do think that Venus semi-square, his Mars-Saturn midpoint, is interesting. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.